All right. Just to summarize, in our last couple of sessions, we're looking at a positive case for the deity of Christ. And we looked at everything from the positive case to the necessity of the deity of Christ for our salvation. And the fact is there's just an abundance, dozens and dozens and dozens of texts that if you ask the right questions and you look at the right criteria, you're going to find that the Bible overwhelmingly teaches that the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, became incarnate, and this is Jesus Christ. He's a God-man. And the question is why would people reject it? And I've mentioned this a few times in previous lectures. It's simply because whether you're a Muslim, whether you're a Jehovah's Witness or another anti-Trinitarian, you're going to reject the deity of Christ. The reason is not because the scripture isn't filled with references to it. It's because you've let your own idea of coherence or reason displace the scriptures. Because you personally can't figure out how three persons can be one God in a monotheistic sense, and that somehow three persons necessarily means three individual gods, plural. Because you've concluded that, then that's why it doesn't matter what argument is brought up. You don't want to be a polytheist equals pagan equals in line with Satan and an idolater. So you're always going to come up with a reason to reject the deity of Christ because you don't want to be in line with Satan and an idolater. And as I've already given in the last lecture, just to recap, again, this is why, as when I talked about the doctrine of the Trinity and divine attributes, why the concept of understanding the metaphysical language, essence, substance, subsistent, mode of subsistence, and then the distinctions, real distinction, formal distinction, modal distinction, ratiocinative distinction, and so forth. All of those, if you don't have those in place, all of a sudden you're just going to really or essentially distinguish everything. So three persons equals three different gods instead of, well, how about, 30 different divine attributes in one God? How do you end up not having 30 independent things, making God a composite thing? And again, I already talked about that, so this is the summary. So again, we finished with the positive case for the deity of Christ. So now we're going to look at the text and arguments, particularly the texts that are commonly raised against the deity of Christ. And just to, by the way, on the first page here, actually of that, it's roughly page 13 in the Christology Part 1 syllabus or handout that I have. And what's important here, though, is go back a little bit to methodology, and I've discussed some of this in earlier lectures, is that remember, if someone claims Christ is not God, they bear the burden of proof to provide some kind of evidence or argument for that. Don't immediately start answering them if they say, well, Christ isn't God, I don't understand. I mean, make them bear some burden, like, well, what's your evidence? What's your argument for why he's not God? I don't understand. What part of it do you not understand? See, make them give you the criteria. Don't just start, kind of blathering out your full 3 or 4 year education that you've gone through in theology and apologetics, because until they're ready to listen, it doesn't matter what you're going to say. So make sure that, again, you're careful about how you do this. So again, burden of proof, burden of persuasion, burden of production. Again, to recap, they make the assertion, put it on them. If we make the assertion that Christ is God, we bear the burden of proof and burden of persuasion and burden of production to produce evidence and sufficient argument to the level of persuasion to say, look, now it's simply more likely than not, or it's even clear and convincing, or it's even beyond a reasonable doubt that Christ is God. And the fact is we've borne our burden of proof. So now looking at these texts raised against the deity of Christ, again, the fact is, we could literally spend hours or half the semester doing the exegesis for every one of these passages. But the important thing to remember about these passages, literally all the passages, with virtually no exception, are raising one of two issues that supposedly disprove the deity of Christ. They either show that Christ has a limitation of some kind, or they show that he has, in some sense, is subordinate to God, okay? Now, both of these are raised, and again, there's a couple of dozen of these that I list in my syllabus. But here's why they're simply irrelevant, because in Christian doctrine, Christ is not merely or only God, Christ is a God-man. So by this idea that Christ is a God-man, what would we expect to find in Scripture? Well, evidence that he is a divine person and has a divine nature and has the divine attributes, does the divine works, all of that. Well, that's exactly what we've already shown. But because we say he's a God-man, he's not only God or only human, that we would also expect to find texts that just show his humanity, that he has a real created, finite, contingent, mutable, fill in the blank there, physical human body. Created, finite, contingent, limited, mutable, human soul or spirit, okay? Now, but that's exactly what we find. We find limitation because he has a real human nature, okay? And then subordination on two levels, again, very important here, is that subordination is that, well, first, humanity and creation by nature is subordinate and requires obedience and submission to God. Yes, Christ in his humanity, again, this is under and subordinate and in submission to God. Okay, so that's the big so what? Or even then, for those that would hold to what's important is that in Trinitarian thought, the concept of eternal functional subordination of the Son and the Spirit, it's just that. It's functional subordination. It's not ontological subordination. The idea that there is a hierarchy of authority among equals, it does not prove that somehow Christ or the Son is a lesser being than God the Father. Any more than, for example, in a human family, children and parents have the same nature, but there's a hierarchy of authority and structure in the family. In the military, generals and admirals are higher in rank and in authority than enlisted men, okay, or women. So the fact is, but they're equal in nature. So somehow showing that there's functional subordination, even in the Trinity, does not necessitate ontological subordination. And so that's why literally all of these passages that are raised do nothing but prove what we already believe, that Christ is fully human. And that according to his humanity, he's going to be, as a human, subordinate to or in submission to God, has to keep the law, has to follow the law, has to pray to God and petition God, do all the things that human beings do as part of our obedience to God. So that's why it's just, like I say, it's literally demur, okay, a legal term that ultimately means so what? You have not raised an issue that gives me any cause for concern whatsoever. So, petition for dismissal of the case, because you just haven't raised anything that requires an answer. Because the answer is simply that, look, okay, so what? That's what we believe. And by the way, Mr. or Mrs. Jehovah's Witness, see, we say Christ is a God-man. Okay, and you bring up all these limitations and growth in knowledge and all these kinds of things. But guess what? You think he's archangel man. Okay, he pre-exists as an archangel and then becomes a human. So why is it if he's an archangel, he has to sleep, he has to eat, he has to do all these other things? Guess what? You've got exactly the same kind of questions to answer to prove your Michael the Archangel theory, who became a man, that we do to prove that Christ is a God-man. But the difference is we've got 2,000 years of good reflection on thought on how Christ is a God-man, where again, Arians and other anti-Trinitarians have very little to nothing on how to think about these issues. So again, in the next segment, what I'm going to do is examine a couple of specific passages to again, just to show that all this proves is humanity or some kind of functional subordination. And then we're going to look at, well, what would be the proper response, for example, because we went through a number of scriptures where people were calling Jesus to his face God, or saying he made a claim to be God. So then we're going to look at what would be the proper response of a righteous creature or being to that. If you really are a created being and a follower of God, what would be a proper response if someone started identifying you as the true God? Okay, so we'll look at that in the next segment. Thanks.